the reason that dyslexia and autism and various other sort of ways of being, the reason they're still here in our human gene pool is because they have value, because they're important to us. So that's a really fundamental distinction, is that it's not a problem. It's, if you're dyslexic, you may have difficulties reading, but the bigger picture as a human ecosystem, there's much more value in you being exactly as you are.
Hello everyone, and welcome to the On the Ball podcast, where we have curious conversation about life, career, spirituality, and anything in between. My name is Eniko Toth, a civil engineer turned world traveler, public speaker, trainer, and Toastmasters champion. My goal is to bring you inspirational topics and people that can help you find your own definition of success. When you are ready, it is time to be on the ball. This podcast will be truly inspiring for you and probably for many people you know. So please share the link of the podcast with them. Also, a quick reminder, hit the subscribe and love buttons to get notified about the upcoming episodes. Then share a rating and a review if you like what you are listening to. My guest today is a music enthusiast and researcher, Robbie Campbell. In his past, Robbie worked in the television industry and took part in filming projects across the globe. He was always interested in music and has been playing multiple instruments since he was a teenager. Robbie also did some music production and sound engineering. However, 10 years ago, he decided to make a change in his career due to his dyslexia. He went back to study and now is writing his Ph.D. Robbie studied ethnomusicology, which is the anthropology of music, and he is studying how different cultures use music. Robbie chose this study because he wanted to understand how songs and in general music can aid communication and what differences it makes when we consider dyslexia. In his studies, he focused on African music with special interest in a small ethnic group in southern Mozambique, the Chopi, who play a very special instrument, the timbila. Robbie spent a year in Mozambique, got to know their culture and music. Now, he's one of the few players of this unique instrument. While he was there, he also filmed 2 documentaries, and since he returned home to London, Robbie has been working on finishing his PhD, from which he's only a few months away. His documentary and his study will soon be available in an unusual thesis, a website that will be open for everyone to visit. When the site is ready, I will make sure to post that and let you know about any updates. Today, Robbie and I will talk about how we can communicate through music, how our stories and cultures get built into songs, how musical cultures are shaped, and how music can help people with dyslexia. There's so much we can learn about this fundamental element of our lives. I don't know about you, but I cannot imagine my day without music. Robbie believes that music is part of the answer to any problem we have. I truly look up to Robbie's knowledge in this field, and I love the way he presents it as well. I cannot wait to get started, so let the episode begin. But before we do so, I would like to let you know that my first chat interview is available as a bonus episode on my Patreon account. Here you can get little behind-the-scenes tweak into the world as podcasters, gain access to the early bird episodes and behind-the-scenes questions that we do not discuss on the podcast. Hello everyone, and welcome back to the On the Ball podcast, where our guest is Robbie Campbell, the ethnomusicologist who is interested in how music can heal and help people with dyslexia. It's a pleasure to have you here, Robbie, and thank you so much for taking the time and being here with us today.
Thank you for asking me. Yeah.
So first of all, we are going to talk during this whole episode about music, but I would like to start with what music is actually, because sometimes we don't understand, and you have a definition of that, or like an understanding. So what would that be? What is music?
Yeah, and you know, from like an ethnomusicological perspective, when we say music, it means like the whole performance, a whole integration of performance. So that includes dance, singing, reenactment, costume, visual arts, masks, storytelling, community gathering, music. Just, in fact, many cultures don't even have a word for music. that means something separate from those things. It's only in English we have a word music where people think I'm going to listen to music or I'll play guitar.
And then you started to get into music to understand how it can help dyslexia. So what's the connection there? What's the connection between music and someone who is dyslexic, or how we think?
So dyslexia is understood as like a reading difficulty, but there's other bigger ways of thinking about dyslexia. One's called neurodiversity, which basically means we all humanly we all think differently, because just like biodiversity or any kind of ecosystem, it's diversity that makes the whole stronger. So as humans, we all think differently, we all look differently, we all, we're big, small, this color, that, whatever. And collectively, it gives us more strength. And dyslexia, according to this idea, is part of that idea, is part of that model, which means that dyslexia isn't actually a problem with reading. The problem with reading is something that's only come along quite recently in our recent human history. Actually, it's to do with processing information patterns slightly differently to other people who aren't dyslexic. It's a style of thinking, basically. So from that perspective, what I'm sort of looking into, what I'm asking the question is music making a way of supporting neurodiversity? When groups of people make music together, does that help different bodies, different brains, and different minds to basically work together? That's kind of what I'm looking at. So it's a really kind of huge question, and it goes back into our whole evolutionary history about why do we make music, because it has some real beneficial purposes for keeping communities together. Why do we think differently? Also because when two people think differently, they can solve more problems than one person can on their own. So I'm looking at how they might both relate. And so in the music I study is called timbila xylophone music. And so I'm kind of asking the question, if you think in different ways, so perhaps if you think very holistically and you think very visually, would you still have a role to play within this musical culture? And the answer is yes, you would, absolutely. And if you think in a very different way, in a very, you might organize your thinking is organized in a different way, would that also allow you to access this kind of music? Absolutely, it would, for different reasons. Dyslexia as essentially a way of being in the world that is helpful and advantageous. So from what's known as the deficit perspective, or a kind of medical perspective, where dyslexia is a problem with reading, there's various studies already that exist that show that when children, particularly, play music together, particularly rhythm or clapping games, that's shown to help their reading skills.
Oh.
And the reason for this is because of the way that dyslexia is understood in terms of the brain, and particularly the auditory system. So the way the brain, the sound system in the brain, it's related to how that is processing the sounds of speech. So speech sounds. Mm-hmm. And of course, the sounds of speech and the sounds of music overlap because they're rhythmic. They have qualities that are similar across both of them. I mean, that in itself is very interesting because, I mean, my research looks at, it's sort of speculating, saying, well, if that is the case, then what about all these musical traditions around the world where children already grow up in very, very rich musical environments, particularly rhythmic musical environments? So the music that I've been studying in southern Mozambique, a xylophone tradition, the children there are playing this very complex rhythmical music from a very, very young age. And so if we have studies in the UK, for example, mm-hmm. that show that by doing clapping games, the body and the brain is basically being regulated, and it's helping the developmental brain become more regulated and robust. then we'd expect to find those same capacities in children from other cultures who are already doing these things. It's just they're not labeled as interventions.
Mm-hmm.
And the other side of it is that if dyslexia isn't seen as a problem in the first place, which, for example, in the xylophone music I study in Mozambique, dyslexia doesn't really exist as a concept because literacy, alphabetic literacy, wasn't traditionally part of their culture. Of course, it is now. It's increasingly so. So the musical tradition emerged completely outside of this need for reading and writing.
Mm-hmm.
So when you think of it from a perspective of what really is dyslexia, then if it's not a problem, then there's much bigger set of relationships which my research explores.
So what is dyslexia then?
Yeah, that's the fundamental question, I think. After researching this myself for over a decade, I think, something like that, I don't feel. I mean, in some ways, I'm no clearer at the beginning, but in many ways, actually, my understanding has opened up greatly. I think dyslexia, the simple answer is to say that dyslexia is many, many different things, and whoever you are and how you look at it will basically define what it means to you. So if you are a teacher or a parent of a dyslexic child, or you are a developmental psychologist who's particularly interested in education and is experiencing through that child a difficulty in reading, then dyslexia will mean that. And the word dyslexia literally comes from the meaning of the word means bad word. So it's a medicalized version. For dyslexic people, and I'm myself am dyslexic, and many, many people, whether they realize it or not, in fact, will have dyslexic tendencies or dyslexic traits. Because dyslexia is a diagnosis, it's a label, a category that's been created as a way to understand something. But in our real experience, those traits are present in everyone. So where the cutoff point is and who is and who isn't dyslexic is a real point of discussion and often argument, because it means who gets access to resources, who gets support and who doesn't, basically. So in answer to your question, what is dyslexia? We have this idea about reading difficulties on one side. The kind of more interesting and bigger idea about what dyslexia is would probably, essentially, it relates to a way of being in the world, which is very difficult to pin down into anything concrete. But some of the most common traits of dyslexia as a positive experience will be creativity, visual spatial strengths. So there's a lot of engineers and artists and architects and creative people, innovators, scientists, who we either know are dyslexic or perhaps historically we suspect that they were dyslexic.
Interesting. Yeah, I never considered dyslexia to be something of a positive trait. Every time when people start talking about dysgraphia or dyslexia or all the other disses, people think it's a disability, it's a problem. So to think about it, something that, okay, maybe you lack something at one hand, but on the other hand, you have some advantages from it. It's something to consider, I would say.
Really, I think that's probably the fundamental point, actually, with the whole of dyslexia research, and that goes back 130 years to the late 19th century was when the whole construct emerged. And it's really only in recent decades that we're starting to argue how important it is to look at it from the other perspective, from the positive side. And actually, from that perspective, it makes a lot more sense in many ways. And really, the reading difficulties are a minor part of it. I mean, I could give the example of...
yeah, please do.
There's an absolute abundance of innovation and creativity that comes from well-known dyslexics. So, for example, there's a study that was looking at the top 5. So the most successful artists, scientists, and architects, the most deemed successful artists, scientists, and architects, the most popular and successful. And of that list there's 12, so 5 in each category of 3. Of those 15, 12 of them were dyslexic.
Wow.
Which is absolutely extraordinary when you think about we're talking about Charles Darwin, Leonardo da Vinci, Pablo Picasso, Richard Rogers, architects, scientists, who have fundamentally changed our human environment through the way that they think.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's probably, I could also add in both Bill Gates and Steve Jobs, who are responsible for, who are behind, with teams around them, who are behind the 2 main computer platforms that exist in the world. Both of them are dyslexic. So if we think about it from that perspective, it's quite easy to see the value of dyslexia, and even more than that, to think, okay, so perhaps none of those people were very good at reading. Was that important? Is that important to how much we've gained from them being exactly how they are?
Mm-hmm.
And what would have happened if they'd gone through intervention programs that had increased their ability to read and made them think in a different way? Would that have been beneficial, or would that not have been beneficial?
Oh, that's a great question. So, but you also mentioned there are different levels of dyslexia. So what are the different stages that people can experience dyslexia? So people, you said, like, some people don't know that they have it, but they can still show some signs of it.
Yeah, I mean, because dyslexia, similarly to autism, actually, they're basically spectrums of experience. There's a continuum of which our entire human population is on the same continuum. So dyslexia really is an idea that is designed to describe a collection of traits that we think converge around one particular experience, and autism is the same. So how many of these traits someone experiences and how intensely they experience them. So basically how much these traits influence the way that they think and act and behave. That's really that would be defined as like how dyslexic someone is, or in which way someone who is dyslexic or autistic may be. I mean, in autism particularly, it's very well known that there's a saying: if you know one autistic person, you know one autistic person.
Yeah.
Because everyone is different, and with autism particularly, as far as my understanding, my research is very much on dyslexia rather than autism. To receive a diagnosis of autism, which itself is called autism spectrum disorder, so there's different kinds, it's mostly actually a decision as to whether that diagnosis is going to be helpful for that individual, not whether they are or are not something. And in some senses, dyslexia is falling behind in this, because there's a diagnostic system that kind of measures certain cognitive processes, and then there is a subjective decision, and also personal histories and family history as well, because these things are hereditary. There's always a subjective decision about whether someone is or isn't dyslexic, and also because these conditions are always changing and have shifted hugely from even when I was in school, let alone generations previously. The incidence of dyslexia will be rising because more people are having assessments, and more people are understanding what it might mean. Yeah.
It just really stick with me that how you said that it can be something positive. Like, I don't know how your experience is when you figured out about dyslexia was, but I remember when I was 7-year-old and I just started reading, I was actually sent to therapy because they said I'm dyslexic. And then people figured out that, okay, probably I'm just afraid of reading aloud because I didn't like the teacher, I didn't like the class. But I still struggle with reading aloud. I can read normally, like if I read quietly, but I do struggle when I need to read out loud long sentences or big paragraphs. So just interesting to consider, like also, like, as we said, the different levels. And I did try to change it. So like, as you said, like what is the consequence if you want to change from one way of thinking to another? So I was kind of pushed to think normally. And yeah, that's kind of the normal for me. I cannot be dyslexic. So when you figured it out, how old were you and what was the first thought that came to you and how did you develop?
So I had a diagnosis of dyslexia 10 years ago, so as an adult in my 30s, long after I'd left school. I'd long suspected that I might have this kind of relationship with dyslexia. I didn't really understand what dyslexia was. I didn't really know how that might affect me. So in a sense, I was quite shocked actually when I got this diagnosis. And at the same time, it kind of made sense. It was like, actually, things started to fall into place. There were lots of things that were confusing that became less confusing. And equally, some things that felt simpler now were much more complicated, but more interesting. And I think the first thing I thought was, what's music got to do with this? Because I was a musician. I wasn't doing any kind of academic study. I was barely reading. I mean, I love reading, but perhaps like you, it's not, it's often not as pleasurable as I'd like it to be. I find it very tiring. It's very claustrophobic. What I was doing was making music, and what started my processing around that time was very much around, so what does this mean for how I'm engaging with music and the way that I'm remembering things, the way that I'm thinking, and the way that I'm creating music, and the way I'm creating music with other people, the instruments that I've chosen to play and the instruments I've chosen not to play. Like perhaps more obviously my relationship to written notation, music notation, which I've never really understood it in a sense. Conceptually, it's been very confusing for me. So I think those first questions for me were actually about music.
So how did you experience this change with music? So as you said, like not reading really the notes or not really, just doing anything written and just experiencing the music. But did you feel anything when you were playing the music? Did it make any differences in your brain when you were playing?
I think, I mean, it's an interesting question as to whether what we know about music is that music does change our bodies and brains, essentially. As infants, our brains are absorbing all this information, particularly language and even emotion and movement, everything. And the brain is structuring itself to match the environment. And when music's in that environment, it has an impact on the brain, and that continues throughout adulthood as well. It's most potent, it's strongest in infancy when the brain is so spongy and malleable. But as adults, music making changes our brains, and it's a question I've asked actually quite a lot. And probably the most obvious thing for me would be rhythm. So clapping and playing rhythm. Guitar was my first instrument, and I was never very comfortable or confident with actually just playing kind of rhythm guitar, just literally strumming a guitar. I felt the motor coordination wasn't very robust. And I mean, actually today it's still probably an area of weakness with my guitar playing. But what I did find is that over years of playing music, particularly with computers, so I used to do a lot of music production, and I'm playing to a metronome. So you're playing to a very regulated rhythm, which is basically exactly the same as what those children were doing in these interventions for dyslexia, is clapping to a rhythm. I think that that synchronization may have changed my brain, because I'm now very strong rhythmically. I mean, I'm particularly strong rhythmically. I play percussion. So that's one area that music may have really helped me physiologically, biologically. I think mostly the more important thing for me is about integrating how I like to express myself musically with this new knowledge about what my strengths might be as a dyslexic person. And particularly this idea of seeing things holistically, seeing the big picture and seeing relationships between things. That's probably the single best known feature of dyslexics, is this, what they call like big picture, holistic, interconnected thinking. And so, for example, with music, particularly with music production, I don't really think through any particular instrument. So I always think as a complete system. So if I change a sound within a composition, then immediately I know that I have to change the sound over here in the composition to balance it. So everything's all connected to everything else. And this is really a way that I certainly, and I think a lot of dyslexics experience the world.
Interesting. And you also mentioned that there are certain instruments that build a connection with us, and there are certain ones that are not aligned with the person we are. So for example, I tried flute, I tried the piano, I tried to play ukulele, guitar, and none of them actually resonated with me. And I always thought like, oh, I just prefer to listen to music instead of playing music because I cannot play any of them. And I recently I discovered the hang drum, and I'm like, oh my god, I love playing with my hands and playing with drums. So what does the instrument that we choose tell about us, and is the music really within us and that aligns with the instrument, or how does that work?
I mean, it's quite interesting, the idea about what is a musical instrument, because we are musical instruments. All we have to do is sing or clap or move or dance to recognize that we're musical instruments ourselves. It's also, you could look at a tree or a river and think that's not a musical instrument, that's a tree and that's a river. But in musical traditions musical cultures around the world, these are used as musical instruments. So there's water drumming, or people use trees in forested environments to communicate messages. So to come back to this idea of organized movement, like we all have individual bodies, and our bodies are unique, our brains are unique, and our bodies are unique. And the way we like to move our bodies is also unique. In fact, it's impossible to exactly copy someone else's movement. You can try, we can imitate the way someone else walks, the way someone else gestures, the way someone else might sign the signature. But to really completely embody someone else is kind of an impossibility, because we are made up of different biological structures. So the relationship with music making really, I mean, there's quite a strong argument to think that music should really come from the way individuals like to move their bodies and organize their movements. And then perhaps a musical instrument, as you know, the word instrument being a device that translates something into something else, because that's what's happening. The musical instrument is just translating your own organized meaning into sound.
Wow.
So for example, you know, a piano is very different kind of movement to a drum. Partly there's a differentiation between fine motor movement, so very detailed digit motion, like you will in a guitar, piano, kora, which is this West African, very beautiful West African instrument, and what's called gross body movement, where you're moving your whole body. So the xylophone tradition that I study, there's no fine motor movement. So you're holding sticks and you're moving your whole upper body and your arms. And so the music experience in the body is a series of momentums moving you from left to right and center, depending on what arm you're playing. So this is just like a really fundamental kind of biological interaction with musical instruments. And these different kinds of musical instruments you you can imagine, anything you can imagine, has a slightly unique way of interacting with it. And really, you know, this John Blacking, this ethnomusicologist who said music is humanly organized sound, he was working with a community in Southern Africa, and within that culture, there's no conceptualization that people can't play music. The idea that you can't play music is they wouldn't understand that, because music is not separate from, if you can speak, then you can sing. If you can walk and move, then you can hit something and play music. So this idea that we have that music is this fundamental, separate, performed, isolated thing is a very kind of, it's a real trait of the, mostly of sort of the Eurocentric Western European culture.
Okay, wow. And then what do you think is the consequence of this industrialized music industry today, that we just create these rhythms, the disco music, the techno music, and whatever is coming out these days? Is it any way different than what we did in the past, and how we, just engineer it?
I mean, in the fundamental answer really is it's not any different, because people make music through whatever technology is available at the time. If you look at the oldest, some of the oldest artifacts we have as humans are flutes made from bones. They at the time were huge technological advances. You know, someone like Bach in the European tradition was a huge, like, he was innovating all sorts of things technologically. So basically that innovation, that curve of innovation, has moved into digital spaces, into music that's created with machine and intelligence. Machine intelligence is basically exactly the same trajectory we've always been on. Only, you know, social environmental conditions have shifted so dramatically that, you know, we might easily compare it to some people in a very, very rural part of Southern Africa who live in a village, where the musical practices are much more directly related to the sounds of the birds or the river, and these much more ecological. We talk about this in terms of literacies. So what we'd call that would be an ecological literacy, whereas what we now have are like technological computer literacies.
Okay.
And dyslexia is mostly based around alphabetic literacy. So really, we've got these different relationships, different kinds of literacy. I think we all kind of know that if you go to Mozambique or even Hungary or Eastern Europe or India, China, Latin America, South, wherever, the way that people make music will create different types of engagement, and that will have an effect on the way people think, in the same way that language, spoken language, has an effect on the way people think. So, for example, you know, in, I think it's Vietnamese, there's no word really for me, for I or you. They talk about people in terms of relationships. So they say like older brother or sister or uncle, and they say your nephews, and so it's all to do with relationships rather than independent self, just because of the nature of the language. Other languages don't have, like in Shona, which is a language in Southern Africa, in sort of Zimbabwe, Mozambique, they don't have a word. So the word to sense something, like your senses, to sense something, there's only one word that means all of your senses. So you'd say, I sense the rain with my eyes, as in I see it. I sense the rain with my ears, I hear it. And so if you use that language, it changes the way you think about. So musical systems are the same, where musical systems are always part of a social dynamic, or always part of a social structure. So it definitely changes the way we think about music. I mean, we do ourselves, listening to popular music or going to a concert. There's a certain way that the whole event is performed. We're expected to take on a role, and that changes in every context.
Interesting. And just getting back for a second on our previous question, we said that for an instrument there is like different movements. So how can we start understanding our preferred way of movement before choosing an instrument? Because you said we should understand ourselves and how music within us works and how we like moving, and then choose an instrument. So how can we do that?
I mean, I guess it's probably more a question for like, for educators, which is slightly outside my field, but certainly, I mean, there's long been musical traditions that have, Kadai it comes to mind immediately, who use, or Dao Crows, who use movement or gestures as ways to help support understanding and engaging with music. I mean, I suppose a simple response might be to say, the more we understand about the differences and the value of trying out different musical instruments and accepting that you're not going to get on with all of them, and being patient and recognizing that, just try these different things and see what works for you. It might be drums, it might be, like a violin, maybe a woodwind instrument. You can only play one note at a time, or even the voice, you can only play one note normally at a time. That's a very different experience to, say, a guitar or a piano, which is harmonic, where you're playing lots of different things at the same time. Drums, which basically, I mean, it's not true to say that drums don't have melody, because there's different pitches that are absolutely fundamental to probably most drumming traditions. But the melodic range is very different. You don't have the same like theoretical relationships as you do with harmonic instruments based on the Western scale, for example. So I think, understanding your body, really, it comes back to understanding your body, which is something that, the European tradition is not very strong on in the way that, say,
no, it's not.
the way that you find in other cultures around the world, are much more integrated. Also with the mind body being separated as it has been, again, in the European tradition, doesn't necessarily help us understand the relationship between minds, bodies, and instruments.
Okay, interesting. And is there a pattern for like what dyslexic people choose as their instruments, or it can be all instruments or all the wide ranges going on, or do they have like a specific pattern that describes and translates into a certain type of instrument?
Yeah, I think there's not that much research on music and dyslexia, outside of looking at the brain and reading difficulties. So when you come to like look at basically how do musicians just like to play in general, and who of those musicians might be dyslexic, it's a very different kind of picture. I mean, I think the most important factor, it probably comes back to music notation. This is in my opinion. So any music that doesn't require you having to read music. So guitar is a very, very popular instrument for everyone. It's portable. It's I'm not saying it's easy to learn, but it's very accessible in lots of ways. I know many musicians who are dyslexic musicians who play guitar. I also know many dyslexic musicians who play drums and percussion. Again, the notation is different. It's not as, again, it can be extremely complicated because of the rhythmic complications. But I think I'd say it's more a way that people might approach music and understand music than necessarily an instrument. And I think in music conservatoires, you're likely to have less dyslexic musicians because of the emphasis on not only the written form, also the very strict method for learning, which is it's not centered around what the individual wants to do. You're coming into a very strict system, which is what dyslexics and learn the way that they want to learn themselves.
Okay, I see. And we also talked about neurodiversity and how music aids that. But what is really music and neurodiversity? and how does music help to develop it?
Yeah, so neurodiversity is a concept that emerged in the late 1990s, and it very much mirrors the idea of biodiversity or ecodiversity. What it's saying is that humans, like ecosystems and forests and everything else, excuse me, humans vary in their bodies and brains, the way they think, in the same way that all species or all individuals within a system do. So neurodiversity is the idea that actually this variation is fundamental for our human survival, and it's a natural evolutionary result of kind of random selections. So the way that humans have evolved, the reason why someone has different kind of hair, heights, sizes, is the same thing. Like everyone has different skills and different abilities, and most importantly, the reason that dyslexia and autism and various other sort of ways of being, the reason they're still here in our human gene pool is because they have value, because they're important to us.
Oh, wow.
So that's a really fundamental distinction, is that it's not a problem. It's, if you're dyslexic, you may have difficulties reading, but the bigger picture as a human ecosystem, there's much more value in you being exactly as you are. And the relationship to music, therefore, is so far little explored. So my research is looking into this, and really all I can do is ask questions. I'm certainly not able to answer the questions. If music making goes back to our evolutionary origins, and so does neurodiversity, then what's the relationship between the two? That's the fundamental question. And what, we can only speculate is, if neurodiversity and music both are that involved in our human story, it's because they're beneficial. It's because they've helped us. And so what I'm wondering is does music making support neurodiversity? Does music making, all these different forms of music making, do they support our brains to be slightly different? Because everyone can take different roles within music ensembles, within musical cultures, within societies. There's all these, we know how many different kinds of music there are. And even within one group or one band, you could say a Western classical orchestra, or even a jazz band or whatever. The different instruments that people play, they do represent different ways of thinking and different ways of organizing, knowing and understanding. And so that, my feeling is that there's a relationship between both of them mutually supporting each other. So in a sense, music making is an expression of neurodiversity, and neurodiversity supports music making.
Okay, so it's like a whole cycle, never ending. It's like kind of like the infinity sign, just going back and forth within itself. Wow.
Yeah, that's one conceptualization. Whether that has value is we're yet to see. I think it would take a lot of different people looking at it from many different perspectives to build a kind of collective idea about what this means.
Wow, interesting. And we also talked about that, yeah, we like certain type of musics, we like certain type of instruments depending on our bodies and way of thinking. But so many people describe their taste of music to be eclectic. What do you say to that? What does that mean about the person?
Well, I think it can mean a number of different things. I think it could mean that many people really like novelty. They like new things. And so perhaps sticking with one genre or one artist or one culture isn't going to be enough to stimulate their interest. And so I think some people are probably motivated by exploring different styles of music. I think another factor may well be that we all see different things in music. So if you're a guitarist, for example, you may be interested in flamenco music because it has a strong, there's famous guitarists in that genre. You may like heavy metal because also there's lots of famous guitarists. You may like country and western or blues or You may like all the genres because of the instrument, because that
Oh, that makes sense.
you may also because it may be any instrument, it may be a particular element in the music. You may like music that makes you feel held emotionally. You may like fast music. And that might be in the classical, Western classical tradition. It might be in any kind of style. So what we see in music is individual, and I remember I was involved in music production, and there's a particular quite famous. He was a sound mixer, so he would like create the kind of final sonic aesthetic of an album.
Mm-hmm.
And he worked on this very famous album by the KLF, a group called the KLF in the 1990s, I think, a real kind of art house group. And I used to love it. And I used to love the way it sounded. It was basically like soundscapes. But then this same person also produced the Spice Girls album decades later, or maybe the same decade.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, like I'm attracted to both, but they're completely different styles of music and in different ways,
Ah.
because there's something in the aesthetic that I find very pleasing. I think his name's Mark Stent.
Mm.
Yeah.
But this makes so much sense. Oh, wow. I never thought of it that way, but yeah, there is most likely there is one instrument that you like, or there is one pattern that you like in those type of musics. And in the last time when we chatted, we also mentioned that music helps us to build connections with ourselves. When we get rid of the notes, we can really tune in and jam together. So is there a difference when we jam alone and just play music for ourselves, or when we play it in a community? Does it have different effects?
Yeah, I mean, music making is done both alone and with other people. And there are slightly different qualities to it. In terms of our health and well-being, there's quite a lot of research from medical scientific disciplines, and also from
Mm.
anthropology and ethnomusicology, to show how vital and important playing music together socially is for our collective well-being. You have neurochemicals released in the brain that support our bodies. We have these like entrainment effects, where the way that you move is activating my brain, and we're moving in synchronization. And so it creates bonding, and it creates there's a whole array of different things that music making does. So for example, things like music notation is taking you away from engaging with people. So the most important thing actually in music is that you're communicating. So there's a sense of, it's a communication. So things like call and response are like ancient practices in music making, where essentially I speak, you speak, I speak, you speak, and you do this musically. So things like improvising, and the language is an improvisation. These things, and movement and dance, these things are what is going to integrate your body in a sense of well-being, not whether you listen to classical music or other musics. Yeah, so basically listening to Mozart isn't going to make you more intelligent. Dancing with your friends and making music in collaborative, communicative ways is how to support the human being. Doing it alone also has a huge amount of value, because people always do it in both ways.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, to get a bit philosophical here, perhaps a little bit existential, when we say alone, we're never really alone, because musical cultures always come through lineages. And
Mm.
so musicians alone in many cultures would consider themselves to be communicating with the spirit world, the natural world, with ancestors. And so, or they're involved in an activity. So perhaps they're walking or journeying. So, I can think of an example of Nguni women in South Africa using mouth harps. These like dang dang
Yeah.
dang dang, these instruments which appear all over the world. they play them as a way to remember. They can play these things and sing songs as ways to remember their interaction with the environment, to be in contact with the environment. There's whole traditions. There's Maskanda music, which again in South Africa, which is very much like a wandering music. It's about journeying, and when you journey, you're never really alone, because you're walking ancestral paths, and you're in touch with all these different kind of elements in our experience and in the environment. The thing about literacy, alphabetic literacy, so like reading and writing as well as musical literacy, there's some really interesting kind of research about this. One aspect of it is that the introduction of alphabetic literacy detaches people from the world, the outside world, because it labels and it organizes experiences into this very linear system. So there's this, one particular person writes about how literally it's changing, or like oral traditions are being reduced by the impact of alphabetic literacy. And so you diminish this set of this really complex, like rich interaction, this relationship with the environment and with each other through these very, very present communicative interactions. Like you step back from it, because alphabetic literacy puts this sort of barrier in between it. That's the argument for that. And music literacy would be exactly the same thing. Rather than say watching you play, I'd be reading some instructions. And of course, there's still a huge amount of shared music making, but it's just reduced because I'm not responding to you anymore. I'm responding to the notes as well as what I'm hearing.
There's a level of disconnection.
Yeah, it break like the thing about music making is it's so like multi-sensory. Like it's hearing, seeing, moving, feeling, and when you put something like literacy in between in the middle of it, it's certainly not going to support that. It's only going to take away something into a more cognitive decoding. Basically, it's a symbolic decoding process rather than a human movement and interaction process. So and the culture that I study, the musical tradition, they don't have any kind of musical literacy. They don't write anything down. So
how do they remember afterwards?
So that's a really important thing about memory. Like, how do people remember anything? So again, music is a perfect way to remember things. So the Quran, the Torah, like epic narratives, they're often set to music or song to remember. People use music to remember long stories. So music, if you play it together, because particularly music that has these cycles that repeat quite quickly, they're like spoken phrases. They're actually based on spoken phrases. If you repeat it, it gets embodied through the movement, and you find that, and you remember it. You don't have to, because it's associated through your whole senses. It's integrated. So
I never thought of it before, but if I think back now, even when we are studying about the Middle Ages or even the ancient Greeks, whenever they were telling stories, they were telling it through music, singing, and with instruments, and they would sing it along, and that's how they would tell the stories of the ancient Greeks and the gods and the great legends.
Absolutely. Yeah. And also like rhyme, like poetry and rhyme. So the fact that it's musical, so it has like, if I say this sentence, but if I say this sentence like that, there's another part of it that you can remember because it has a melodic contour. And if I rhyme that sentence with another sentence, it adds in another. There's all these scaffoldings that create, mnemonic. They're like memory flag points for memory, and music is full of them. Also movements, like they dance in certain ways, and they have rhyming poetry, and it has melody, and it has rhythm. It's all reasons how we remember things.
So how can we get more connected to this side of our society, the community, and not reading the notes anymore, not really Just to start being more intuitive and listening and tuning with the other person, how can we get started on that?
I mean, I think music is a great tool for lots of things. So there's lots of educational systems, Kodai included, Dalcroze, Montessori, in Steiner school. You know, there's all these different educational approaches that use music because of these connective, you know, properties of it. So, I mean, one simple way is to get kids to do more. Well, we should all just play more music. I mean, that's like a really, really basic kind of recommendation that people have been saying for hundreds of years. Is just let's keep on playing music together. In terms of how to, like your first question, you know, about how to encourage, you know, oral wisdom traditions that have been around for many, many generations and that are absolutely vital, particularly now in this time of, you know, global climate, you know, problems. How do we bring in these very, very ecological, communicative understandings? I mean, it's not easy because basically we're dealing with economic power, political power. We're dealing with economies that are built on growth, not on well-being. We're dealing with huge consumption. We're dealing with like information, you know, like technologies. And basically, when you know, you, I, and other people might say, "Oh, but look, you know, what about these people? The value of these musical practices, which may be basically about teaching the next generation how important the environment is, how to respect nature, how to act in a way that is going to support the well-being of the community. How do we bring that into our schools? And how do we learn it? How do we invite these people to teach us? These are the questions that have been circling for, you know, hundreds of years, and I think they're more urgent now than ever. And lots of people are, you know, trying to find ways of doing this.
So do you think music could be an answer?
I mean, I like me personally, I think music's the answer to like everything. In some way, music is the answer to everything, or music is part of every answer. I think that's probably the way I'd say it. Somewhere along the line, every human challenge that we have, music can help. Not on its own, where it's not necessarily going to solve things, but it will support whatever is going to solve it. And so, yeah, you know, our bodies and brains respond well to music. As social groups, we respond well to music. There's nothing bad about it.
Wow, beautiful. And yeah, how we think about music defines what we do about it. And sometimes we just need to switch our thinking and yeah, ask different questions and accept that what is different is not necessarily bad. So I think we can conclude our conversation with that sentence. I really enjoyed that you opened my mind for dyslexia could be a positive thing because it can be creativity, it can be beneficial for engineers and scientists as well. It's like it's mind blowing for me at least. I hope the listeners feel the same as well. So we are leading up to the final questions. So I have a few questions that I asked from everyone, and the first one of that is, what is success for you?
I think success would be related to well-being, to health and happiness and well-being. And I think from my perspective also perhaps a sense of serving and offering and supporting others. I think making the best with the conditions I have and creating something more than what was there at the beginning.
My next question to you is that you have been living with indigenous people in Mozambique. You have been traveling a lot and trying to understand different cultures. And I'm always about representing old wisdoms and something that we can learn from our ancestors, the older generations. So what was something in your life, a knowledge that you attained from someone you knew or you didn't know? It could be a book or type of music that really aligned with you, and you said, that wisdom I would like to carry on throughout my life with me.
Yeah, it's a very beautiful question. Wow, I sort of feel like, yeah, I need to like spend a month kind of thinking about that. A wisdom that's been passed down to me. Okay, so perhaps, all right. So I remember my dad used to say to me, if someone gives you something for no reason, then offer them something more in return. And I think that's something that I feel very connected with and I admire.
Why?
Because when you offer someone something, I'm also including here the context and the energy with which he held that. When you offer someone something that's meaningful to you, with a view to helping them with whatever they need, that always opens a space. And I think what we need mostly is to open more spaces, not close them down. So the more people can open spaces with each other, and giving something can be time, it could be material resources, it can just be presence. I think that's one of the most profound things to offer someone, is just your presence. Because the idea is to try and just open a space.
Yeah. And especially in this world, I don't think we gift too many people with our presence. We are always somewhere else, either in the past or in the future, or just on our social media accounts. But we hardly ever are present in the moment with the other person. So I think that's a valuable message, to just give back, give something in return for you being present with me. Thank you, Robbie, for being present with me here today and having this conversation with me. It was a pleasure.
It's a pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me. Yeah.
Such an insightful interview. I believe everyone should listen to this. Thank you for being here, and thank you, Robbie, for sharing your knowledge with us on music and neurodiversity. For me, the most mind-blowing part was when we discussed how dyslexia and even autism can become an advantage in some areas of our lives. It is so true that something only becomes a problem or a disability when we define it like that. So let us redefine what disability is and start understanding that we are perfect the way we are. We just give our gifts to society in different ways. What was your favorite take on this episode? Let me know on Instagram at enikototh.me. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out, or if you have a guest recommendation, I would also love to hear from you. Have a wonderful day and see you on the next episode.
If you found this episode motivating, make sure that you share it with others and text this to your friend right now who you think would be inspired by this story. The best way to live a happy and fulfilled life is to serve others. So share this episode with people you care about. It has no cost, but will elevate them and make their lives even better. If this is your first time here, click that love and subscribe buttons and make sure that you leave a rating and review. I would love to hear your thoughts and feedback on how this message lifted you up, brought you a change into your life. I would also love to hear your own definition of success. I'm so grateful for your support, sending love and great health to you all. And now it is time for you to be on the ball.